Okay, everybody, I think we are ready for the next session. It's a great pleasure to introduce Ali Aljasem, who is going to talk about In the Shadow of the State, the rise of Kata'ib Al-Baath at Aleppo University after 2011. Ali is a researcher at the Center for Conflict Studies at Utrecht University, and he focuses on paramilitary groups in Syria. He's also a senior consultant for the Dialogue Advisory Group and a board member of the Daman humanitarian organization. Formerly, he has worked as for the Doctors Without Borders and also as a security and safety advisor in Aleppo. And Ali holds an MA in conflict studies and human rights from Utrecht University. I enjoyed very much the paper, which I will get back to, so I'm looking very much forward to your presentation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Morten, for the introduction. Can you hear me well? It's like there is, okay. And I would like to extend thanks to the Arab Center also for this great opportunity and great minds sitting around the table and picking their minds on my topic and other people's too. And I would like also to say that I think I'm the only one who is not a PhD, so excuse my juniority and yes, the flows in the presentation and everything. Anyway, so just to get directly into my topic, which is actually looking beyond the main focus, at least so far, of the presentations, and I'm challenging the general or the stereotypical lens people are looking at the Syrian conflict from a sectarian perspective. I look beyond the sectarian narrative and perspective in the Syrian conflict, with the focus on Aleppo, which is a predominantly Arab Sunni city with Christians and Kurds. Just don't quote me on the majority thing. So the lens I'm applying or looking at my case is the communitarian and the intra-communal links and powerful people inside some institutions, the Baath party. So the word Kata'ib means legions or groups. So just for those who cannot speak Arabic, Al-Baath is the main political party in Syria. So my focus on the groups or the militias, the paramilitary groups that are affiliated with the political party. So this is just to be very focused. I'm not looking at other types of militias. There are a lot of foreign-sponsored militias. There are sectarian militias, etc. So my focus is the political party and mainly the students, and I will come to this in my presentation. Why the students? And to start with, I hope you can read and also taking notes of Morten's main kind of concern when addressing or commenting on people's work, what I call like 3 W's and H. So the main 4 questions. So the first is what is this a case of? This is a case of civilians mobilization to join paramilitary groups. And paramilitaries, I understand paramilitaries as clandestine, irregular armed organizations carrying out illegal acts of violence against clearly defined civilians or civilian individuals or groups. I mean, looking back at the history of paramilitary forces, paramilitary groups or forces have emerged in a range of civil wars as caliphs and others. theorize, including ethnic or separatist insurgencies, as well as uprisings against dictatorships. I mean, there is a big difference between paramilitaries and official militaries. The main argument is the structure. While official military organizations tend to be rigidly organized along regimental hierarchical structure or lines, paramilitaries are less formally structured, and they are characterized by their, as Linders describe them, hierarchical structure. So they tend to be organized along social arrangements and individual or powerful individual people, be it tribal or societal or political figures in the society. And why, answering the question why examining this phenomena, or why is it important to look at this case? So I would like to also mention something that I answer this question theoretically and empirically, so in order not to get confused. Well, it is very important to understand how regimes adapt to challenges and disturbances, as Heidemann and Linders call it, as authoritarian upgrading or recompetent kind of adaptations of regimes. And now we are, after the end of the Cold War, drawing also on Huntington book of the future of of wars. Now we are not seeing any symmetric conventional wars anymore. Rather, we are witnessing asymmetric, non-conventional conflicts, and they are mostly inside borders. And there are a lot of there is a great literature or broad literature on hybrid warfare, proxy warfare, etc. So that it is very important to understand this phenomena from that perspective, that we are entering a new field of confrontations or conflicts. And also, in the Syrian case, I'm interested to see the different regimes, regulations, and adaptations, and we discussed this yesterday, and how the regime regulates its relationships to ethnicities and to identities. And what I'm interested also in is, by looking at these groups and networks of violence, I aim to identify war criminals which might be dropped or the international community is not willing to persecute. And the Syrian case is a very clear example of vetoing, referring the Syrian file to the ICC. So we should do it ourselves. And how I do this, this has a lot of methodological complexities. First, I shift the perspective from examining the phenomena from looking at through sectarian lenses, by looking at from intracommunal or communitarian lenses, because I thought, or when I was struggling with finding an analytic frame, sectarian analytic is in the Syrian case is straitjacketing, so it is not applicable to the Syrian case. I mean, in my case, which is Aleppo. So I look at the links of individuals and the roles they played in mobilizing civilians. I do that by tracking key individuals' history, and you will see in my presentation, and how they were rewarded and promoted. And I would like to also mention, the regime strategy, which is the coup-proof strategy, which was also theorized by Makara 2013. So she argues that regimes, in authoritarian regimes, coercive apparatus building depends on three strategies. First, creating parallel security institutions. These constitutions do not complement each other, but they are liable to each other. And secondly, by distributing material incentives selectively, which is the case here, and finally by exploiting the communal ties. It is divide and rule, and looking at where specific groups are standing, and then exploiting these ties. And the question, who cares, and who is my audience? I have plenty of, or a broad audience. Yeah, that could be, political and social scientists, genocide and war studies, law and criminology, and of course the Arab Center, because otherwise they would have not invited me. And of course myself and the victims of these groups, aiming or hoping to be their voice. So that is the most of the time people say the boring theoretical part. So let's move to the where these groups, or culturally, historically, these groups came from. So we have of course, we have the legacy of the Ottoman Empire and all these, framing the Qabadai, a gallant guy who is, tough, and that the typical shape, the Shami kind of environment. And at the same time, we have the Az'ar. So the Qabadai is a good guy who defends the victims and protects women, etc. That is the typical. And we have the Az'ar, who is a naughty guy, pesky, who would be really intimidating other people. And that is for Arabs in the room. They know very well who this guy is. So moving to the real people, to the Shabiha. This is the typical image of the Shabiha groups in Syria. And Shabiha, back in history, the word Shabih comes from the Mercedes Benz car model Ghost, which translates literally into Shabah in Arabic. So these groups flourished when Assad took power in early 70s. So they were their main job was they were smugglers. So they were smuggling between Lebanon and Syria, and they were using these fancy cars, that Ghost, and so that's why they came to be called Shabiha, and they are proud of calling themselves Shabiha to intimidate other people, and so they have a long history. They are described to be gangs, criminals, mafia-like people linked to the Assad family, and the main guy who was behind them is the brother of Hafez al-Assad, Rifat, who is currently residing or taking protection in France. But just to define the Shabiha, the Shabiha is, as defined by Yassin Haj Saleh, who is a Syrian writer, is a raw force which mirrors the structure and goals of the regime, whose aim is to accumulate personal wealth and ensures its own survival at all costs. And what is interesting about, as also Alvarez, who was looking at the Serbian Arkan's Serbian Tigers, that these groups are loyal to the regime rather than to the state. Who pays more, they would be loyal to. So they are beyond the mercenary, and even going back to how they call each other, it comes also from the qabadai, al-khal, the uncle, so or ma'allim, so the boss. So they don't call each other with names. So they have also kind of this, their own kind of culture of dealing or with each other, but that was only for smuggling. But when the state or the government, the regime was witnessing disturbances or uprisings, in the first one was in the 1979, the uprising of the Islamic Brotherhood, and the kind of the shake that the regime got during these years. It was very important to institutionalize and also make sure that you have a clear backup. Because if you look at the Syrian structure, the Syrian sectarian structure, you have more than 85% of the population as Arab or Sunnis. So it is, and the army is a conscription army. So what we saw in the early uprising of 2011, 2012, there were a lot of defections. So that there was a military power gap. The regime needed to fill that gap. So the best thing is to resort to other means than the conventional army. So those guys were filling the military gap and the manpower in the aftermath of the defections and or desertions of military groups. I look back into the case by what Eva Belen also called the analogy thinking. So great minds think alike, but bad minds also think alike. When Hafiz al-Assad visited North Korea in 1974, he was impressed by how the society was, as Salwa Ismail calls, the inframing of the society. So you would have structures and organizations that people have to be signed up to. You cannot, for example, when you are in your first grade, you will have the Vanguard's organization, Kata'ib Al-Baath. When you are 6 years old, you have to join this organization. When you enter the secondary school, you have the revolutionary organization or the youth revolutionary organization, Shabibat al-Thawra. So every age group is inframed into like the North Korean example. So Hafiz al-Assad was impressed by this idea, and it was implemented in Syria. And you see the inframing and indoctrination. That picture here was in 2007 when Bashar al-Assad was re-elected. So I was at Aleppo University, and we were forced to join like a student march to go to Damascus, wear T-shirt with Bashar al-Assad picture on it, and with torches. And the campaign was, "We are with you, and you have to be with him, otherwise I won't be here." So this is a very clear example of mobilizing the masses for when there is a challenge, or when it could be also an example or of what happened in Iran or to Soleimani 2 days ago, how people were mobilized when there is kind of an international pressure. And that is another example of school students mobilizing. That was in 2005 after the creation or the implementation of the Hariri International Criminal Court. So the Detlef Meles report came out, and people were demonstrating that that is unfair, and you are accusing us of something. And you see this is the Baath indoctrination. When you become a senior member, you have to do a Nazi-like salute and all these types of ideology. So this is what I call indoctrination of civil society. So these are ready people to mobilize, and when the regime was under threat, we had the first guy I think you all know, Rami Makhlouf, was a tycoon and a maternal relative to Bashar al-Assad, who owns more than 60% of the Syrian economy. He was the protesters were chanting against him at the beginning. He appeared on TV in July 2011. He said that I'm going to give away my fortune. I'm going to, become a charity person. He made, a Samaritan. He turned suddenly into a Samaritan person that who was willing to give away everything, and indeed he did that. And he has it's an organization or a charity that is called Al-Bustan, which he turned it into a recruiting agency. So people were signing up just to receive social assistance, but on the condition of joining what the other guy, Saad Zamam, who is an engineer. He doesn't have anything to do with military, but he proposed the idea of creating what the regime calls the popular committees, Al-Lijan al-Sha'biyya. So the idea of these, that you would assign the vigilance of neighborhoods to locals. So that has a lot of also advantages, as many theorize. You have access to local intelligence information, and also less deployment expenses and resources. So it is very important to recruit locally, and it is cheap. And the most important thing for the regime at that time is the loyalty. If you would witness any protest activities, you would report that to the security forces. And what is interesting about this is their links to the mukhabarat, or to the security services, and not to the military. So they have links with the security services, not the military. So this is the general kind of mobilization, or where these groups or how these groups started. In the case of Aleppo, there appeared 3 types of paramilitary groups, so we just had Morten and I had discussion on the many questions that I had or research ideas I had in my paper. So that is why I'm working on a broader project to examine all these groups. So there appeared 3 types of paramilitary groups. First, what I call a crony-like armed groups, like those who are affiliated with businessmen and who are sponsored also by businessmen. And we see here this guy. His name is Sami Ubari, and those who are from Syria know the family of Ubari very well, the pharmaceutical and business family in Aleppo. So this guy was sponsoring a big paramilitary group, and the other guy is, or the other group is the tribal linked group, or what I call like communitarian groups, and this guy is the head of one of the main clans or tribes in Aleppo, and this guy is Hassan Barri. When the Free Syrian Army entered Aleppo in 2012, they arrested him and summarily executed him when they first caught him. And the third type is the political parties, affiliated groups, and what I call also in my paper as not ideological, but it is incentive driven groups, those who are looking for glory and promotions. And in my case, I look at this. I only focus on this group. I don't tackle the business and the tribal groups. My only focus is the political party affiliated groups, or Hizb al-Baath, because it's the only active political party in the country. So how we have this, or what is the logic? So the Syrian, even the Ba'athists, at the beginning of the uprising, they were divided. Some people were pro the uprising, or they were kind of pro reformation, as or what the Bashar al-Assad was kind of propagating for, that we are in the process of reforming the system. But that never happened. That's why a lot of defection happened, and also new faces started to appear. So the idea of Kata'ib Al-Baath came from this guy. His name is Hilal, who is from Aleppo. He was the head of the executive of the Ba'ath branch in Aleppo. So he came up with the idea, because Al-Ba'ath brigades, or Kata'ib Al-Baath, started from Aleppo, because he used his links to mobilize the Ba'ath members. And the guy on his left, Ammar Saati, who is the head of the National Union of Syrian Students, which what I am looking at. So those two guys, coincidentally, they are both engineers. They don't have anything to do with militaries, but they have, for example, Ammar Saati was in office, or the head of the National Union of Syrian Students, since 1995. So he has created his own empire of loyalties inside the organization. So now we see these those guys in uniform. So this is the head of. Now he was promoted. Hilal was promoted to become the secretary assistant of the Ba'ath political party. I mean, he's the second person after Bashar al-Assad. So you can imagine how rewarding it was for him to mobilize the students. And the other guy is Ammar Saati, who became in the general command of the Ba'ath party. A special office was created for him, the youth office. So he was also promoted from the head of the National Union of Syrian Students to become the head of the youth office, overseeing all youth organizations. And this guy is the head of Kata'ib Al-Baath in the country. And the other guy is from Aleppo, Omar Aroub, is his deputy and the one overseeing the groups inside Aleppo. And here you see also another picture of them being, with Russians, and also they were trained by the Russians, and at some point by the Iranians. So they had a great role in mobilizing Ba'athists, and also due to the role of these people, they mobilized the students. And this is a picture of I mean, how can we define or spot these groups? I mean, if you look at their uniform, they don't have uniform, cascades, sunglasses, T-shirts, etc. So that is those people are posing in front of the Ba'ath. Those who can read, this is the Ba'ath branch inside the university. So Al-Ba'ath branch would oversee all the activities inside the university, and those guys were in charge of, protecting and also manning the entrances of the universities, because they can identify activists, and it is very easy for them to pinpoint who is who is who and who is, you know, activist, etc. So they were giving great roles and incentives inside the university. They were not required to attend the classes. They were also kind of given prestigious promotions. They could carry guns inside the campus. It's an intimidating, it's the performance of power and superiority inside the university. So you see, also those who have grievances against other sects that would join these groups for such things. And when we look at the deployment, they are always at the forefront of the military or the security services. If you look at them, because they can identify the activist. Here is a demonstration, and those guys, you know, in civilian clothes heading. And here we see the physical act of violence that they have been committing, and I witnessed that myself, of how they kind of take the initiative and attack the demonstrations, and later on they were participating in you know, in the front lines. They deployed in the front lines, fought fiercely with the regime. Another example is I'm not sure if you can read. So we have looked at those two big guys who were promoted, one as the deputy or the secretary assistant of Bashar al-Assad, the other is in the general command, and we have the other two guys, Bassem Sudan, who is the head of the Kata'ib Al-Baath. He also was given a seat in the People's Representatives House, in the People's House, and the other guy, Omar Arab, who is his deputy, also in that same place. And what is interesting is also, though, those are entitled to get diplomatic passports. So you usually see them traveling around the world, but they go unnoticed. And 2 months ago, they were in Romania for a conference. So it is very interesting how they kind of take advantage of the system, and also they play a very important role in kind of the regime's survival. So I would leave it here, and looking forward to your comments and feedback, questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ali, for an excellent presentation. And it's always nice to see that you have some kind of impact. Sometimes when you publish out in a black thing, a black hole, and you don't know if anybody reads or care about what you do. And here it was wonderful to see what I had said earlier actually had some impact. That you structured the first slide according to my 4 classic questions. The problem is, of course, then that you are then stealing my structure for how to comment, because you have addressed my classic questions in advance, so I cannot pose these kind of questions. So now I have to have another kind of structure, but I do have another kind of structure. I think it's an impressive paper, and I enjoyed very much reading it. It's a well-written paper. It has a deep, detailed, empirical knowledge about what is going on in Syria and what's going on in a specific place in Aleppo at Aleppo University. And I think that is very useful. To have people with genuine insights into the details, that's very important. The specific mechanism and so on and so forth. Sometimes these kind of papers, they do not have any reference, they're not aware of the existing literature. Unfortunately, that is not the case in your paper, where I was very impressed about how the knowledge you have about the state of the art. You're really making the references to the relevant literature. I think now and then some scholar came to mind, this person could be relevant to cite, and then at the next page the person shows up. So I think it's a nice example of how you have deep empirical knowledge, but you also know about the academic literature. I enjoyed it very much. And then I also think and enjoyed that the kind of focus you have, that you're focusing on the micro level. In the debate about Syria, there's been a lot of attention, for good reasons, I think, on the dynamics between the regional, international, and the national level, the role of external powers and so on and so forth, and how they then relate to local actors. But what you're doing then, your focus is more on the microdynamics, and also to focus on the relationship between the center in Syria and the periphery. I don't know if you can call Aleppo the periphery, really, but at least the internal dynamics within Syria. I think that's also important dimension to add to the broader, to the existing literature on the role of external actors. So in that way, you are making an important contribution. You know, when you're making commenting on thing, then we are taught often that you should use the sandwich model. First you say some nice things, then you have some critique, and then you say some nice thing at the end. And always when people are commenting, you should wait for the however. and I do have a however, and it is just in a constructive sense, but because I think the richness, all the deep empirical knowledge you have, all the knowledge you have of the existing literature is very impressive, but it also constitutes a kind of challenge for the paper, in the sense that you want to do so many things. And while you have, it appears that while you have been writing this paper, all kinds of ideas have come to your mind. Because, oh, that is actually also interesting to this debate, and there's this literature which actually also relates to what I observe, and so on and so forth. So when I supervise the first session, often when I supervise master thesis and PhD students, my classic question is, there are plenty of good theses here, which one do you want to write? In the sense that when people are presenting me with their first paper with ideas, there are material for 10 theses. And then they have to make the hard decision which 9 potential theses should be forgotten, and instead focus on one. And I think that there are so much, there are 5 papers which can be written based on your material. But it's important to, and that's my second point here, is also that it's good to have one clear argument, one claim to fame in a paper. And then you can have another paper where you have another claim to fame, and a third paper. And I think you have material for several papers, actually. And there it's also useful to make this elevator speech, which Simon talked about yesterday, which I also like, this kind of, you are going into an elevator, Professor Hotshot, which you have always dreamt about meeting. Then she asks, okay, what are you doing? And then from the ground floor to the 5th floor, you should be able to say, okay, my work is about. Its basic question is, my claim is, and I'm doing it in that way. So, and I think it can be a good exercise always to think about, how do I make my elevator speech, and if you should make your elevator speech for this paper, it might be a quite tall building we should be in, because you actually want to do several things, and I will get back to that. Another general point I often make to my students is there are 2 kinds of ways of writing. There are two kinds of papers, and both are important. One way of writing is the way of writing where you learn while writing. And there often you will start here and you will end there, and you will be much wiser during the writing process. And then there's another way of having a paper where you from the start know what the argument is, and then you use all the energy to convince the reader about your narrative, but you know the narrative from the beginning. When you submit a paper for a journal, it should be the last kind of paper, where you have a clear argument. It is not that you are starting here and then you get much wiser at the end. But often you need to write the first kind of paper in order to be able to write the second kind of paper. And I think if you reread the paper you have here, it's quite obvious that it has a tendency to be the first kind where you get ideas along the way. And oh, wow, there's okay, China and Serbia is also interesting. Hey, there are some comparisons. There are so many ideas which can come to your mind, and for instance, also your point at the end, as for Calvias, actually pops up at the end. It was like, wow, it could be interesting, and I want to engage with him. But it comes at the very end rather than at the beginning. So it is just this kind of second round, I think, the paper needs, where you have this nice and need to know criteria all the time, where you have this. You're completely sure about what your research question is, and what is not making you more clever about your research question belongs in another paper. Because there are a lot of stuff which is really, really interesting, but maybe it's a bit of distraction for your main argument. And it's by no means because it is not fascinating and really important, and I would see a fully fleshed out paper on this dimension. So you have a lot of material, and you have also a lot of theoretical knowledge and empirical knowledge, and you know the debate, and that's fantastic, I think. And then you have the challenge as for focusing the paper. Also, one kind of first choice you need to make is the nature of the paper. It is also what kind of scholar and what kind of debate, who cares, debate. Do you want to talk to a political science audience? Or do you want to talk to historians, area studies? There the kind of style will be different. Also, for instance, there's a tendency in political science that a theory is God, cases are tools to examine some theoretical puzzle. And then area studies people often see, okay, theory is interesting to the extent it can inform my case. Because actually what is really important and interesting is my case. Both approaches are completely valid and important, but they are different. As for whether the theory is the main goal and the cases will be a tool, or reverse, that the case is actually what is going to be explained, and then I need some tools to explain my case, and there I need some theory. And there I see a kind of tension in your paper right now, that you actually are interested in both. For instance, at the very start, you write how the article focuses on how civil society organizations like NUSS mobilized its members to oppress their fellow classmates and so on. So, okay, this sounds as a more general question. How do civil society organizations mobilize and so on and so forth? And then you have a case, which is NUSS. In principle, you could have other cases from other parts of the world, but now you're focusing in this case, but it's a theoretical puzzle. But one could also have a project that, and part of the paper goes in that direction, that you are really interested in understanding this case and understand the Syrian case, and the dynamics at Aleppo University, what went actually on there. And both kinds of takes are, I think, are really are valid and can work very well. But maybe it is important to consider if also you are speaking into a debate among Syrian specialists, or are you speaking into somebody to a group of scholars who are not particularly interested in Syria, but they are interested in some of the more theoretical issues? How do paramilitary groups mobilize all around the world? And then Syria is a case, but it's not that you are going to sell your argument not because of the Syria details, but because of the theoretical contributions. Whereas if you talk to the Syrian scholars, then it is because you have some fantastic micro insights into the Syrian case. And that relates to my point about how there are a number of potential questions at play in the paper. You state in the beginning, as I said, that you are interested, and that's very nice that you say that this article focuses on this how civil society organization, and it's also interesting that you oppose the how question. And it's a good question, and one could also pose the why questions, or the which consequences, or to what extent is this different from other places. And so you choose this, and that's not a problem in that at all. But during the paper, as it evolves, a number of other questions emerges because you find them interesting also. And I don't have any problems understanding that because they are interesting questions. For instance, you are also interested in understanding why do regimes actually use paramilitary groups? Why do they choose that strategy? That's actually part of the paper. You are addressing this in a convincing way. Why not then? Because as for research questions, it's like either you are having a research question and then are fitting everything according to your research question, or you do it the other way around and don't tell your supervisor that actually I'm figuring what I'm actually doing, and then I have to make a question that fits to what I'm actually doing. But no matter what, there should be a match between what you're doing and the question you ask. And either you can get the person you love, or you must love the person you can get. In the sense of just ensure there's a match between what you're doing and the question you are presenting. And actually you are also engaging in discussions as for why. So why not present that in the introduction, that it is not only the how, but actually also the why question you're interested in. I also noticed that you point to some of these dynamics, some of these groups can actually also be identified before 2011. For instance, at the 1982 Hammer and so on and so forth. A very interesting thought, and I thought, oh, that's a new paper. But it is not here. That paper belongs. But it could be interesting to also to have another paper examining. Okay, at one level there are similarities. These groups have a history, and you could also see them in 1982. But is it then the same thing that is going on in 1982 as post 2011? If not, why? How have things changed, and so on and so forth? And that's a paper in itself. And I'm sure actually you have the material to make that paper also. And then you're also making the point about how Aleppo University, the sectarian dimension doesn't really matter. Unlike in Homs and these kind of places. Fascinating. Again, the third paper you have here. How come that, okay, sectarianism matters in some places in Syria, but in other places it does not? And that's also the case when it comes to these paramilitary groups, the dynamics at universities. So you actually have a puzzle. Why is it that in some places of Syria it was a dimension to consider, at other places it was not? So that's the third paper. Then you have a fourth paper, potential paper, also that you're pointing to, okay, these dynamics we're seeing, actually they are not, we have seen something like this also in Serbia, in Chechnya, Some of the dynamics, as you say, are also you saw something similar in Mao's China and so on and so forth. Okay, to what extent is it similar, different from these kind of places? And again, you should not flesh that argument out in this paper, but that actually also a quite interesting paper to examine to what extent are these general dynamics. And if you did such kind of paper, that would speak to a generalist audience with interest in paramilitary groups who really didn't care about Syria, but were interested in how to mobilize paramilitary groups. And there you could frame it through that angle. And then you, at the very end, you point to Kalivas and point to how he has an argument about the importance of external actors. And you're saying, no, actually, local actors are much more important. I think, why does that appear at page 17 rather than at the very start? Saying, okay, there's a lot of literature written, and so much of it focuses on the dimension between external actors and national actors. Okay, that's very fine, but I am claiming now, I am contributing to the existing literature by pointing to how we should pay much more attention to the microdynamics at the local level, and it's the dynamics between Damascus, Aleppo, which is, has not received sufficient attention. Because then you also carve out a space for yourself in the existing literature on why there's a need for your paper. So we end up with 4 or 5 papers. Yeah, there's material for a PhD. If you go for the article model in the PhD system, which you can do in Denmark, for instance, then you actually have a very nice... and the point is, I think you have much of the empirical material. And yeah, I think also you know a lot about the relevant theoretical literature. So it is just a reminder of being careful, not doing too much in one paper, but have one specific argument, and then do this hard, nice, and need to know thing. Always think about, okay, is this relevant for my research question? If not, it belongs in another paper, in order to make a streamlined paper. So my last kind of comments then relates one that I have some as for style. It is not it is an unfinished paper in the sense that there's a section which will arrive at a time, but you have not still had time to write it. So there's not a real conclusion in that way, because you are. Yeah, you are in the process, and it's a working paper, it's perfectly fine. I also notice as a minor thing that your reference system changes. At page 10, you go from in-text citation to footnotes. And then a good colleague of mine, I think I mentioned that one of the other days also, said that he doesn't like to be surprised. So when he starts to read a paper, he reads the introduction, and then he's going to figure out whether he bothers continuing. So there he needs a really clear picture of what he is going to expect, and he should be really interested. And he should also know what is going to happen. So I think there it's useful, one, to present the argument in the introduction my claim is, and then the reader should be really interested in knowing, okay, how do you reach that conclusion? I need to read the whole paper in order to understand how you reach that conclusion, because that's an exciting conclusion. And then I think also it's very useful to provide a roadmap in the beginning of the paper. This paper is structured in this way. There will be 3 or 4 sections, this and this is going to happen, because while you're reading, you know where you are in the argument. So that can be useful. And then I think also it can be useful for each section. So start the section by saying what I'm going to do in this section is, and then at the end of the section, what have I done in this section is, with a kind of takeaway point. What you should really, what is the takeaway point from this section or this chapter is this, to help the reader. And then also argue for your choices, For instance, you focus on Aleppo University. I think it's really interesting. But why not come up with a clear argument why you're using? For instance, it appears that things are quite different in Homs. So why, and the real reason why you're using Aleppo University is by chance you know more about Aleppo University because of your own history. But if you can construct an argument on why Aleppo University is actually quite interesting, is it a most likely, least likely case, or is it something where some other place it happens to be that the sectarian dimension matters, but not in Aleppo, but what's going on here actually? So just to make a clear argument for your choice. And then my last point, I believe, as for, I think it could be useful if you making your theoretical frame more explicit. Because that could guide the paper and inform the reader why you're doing. Why do you focus on what you're focusing on? To have some more clear theoretical framework. And then one way to go could be a kind of a social movement theory, like, and we discussed it just in the break. But that is one possible framework. Or you could start with Kalivas and then use that and try and explain why you want to transcend the focus he presents. And that's also kind of what kind of genre, what kind of audience you're speaking into. Whether, as Paul Tsai will often have theory very explicit, and the section will be guided by theory, while other disciplines will have a more narrative approach where theories will be more implicit. Historians often will use theory in a far less explicit way, and both ways are valid, but it's good to have in mind what kind of audiences you are speaking to. I think those were my comments, and I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot, and I really liked it, so Mabruk.
Shall I answer?
Maybe if you have any remarks,
Yeah.
just a few remarks, then I think we should open the table after.
Yeah. So just just a quick replies or defense. Thank you so much for really the very constructive feedback, and yeah, you are right. I mean, just like to start from where you ended, because my supervisor actually is a historian, so that's why it explains a lot, and he and the paper comes as part of like a Syria oral history project. So this is one episode of many cases, and I would like also to go back to your idea on the many topics in or questions raised in one paper, because indeed I was a student, I was a member of the NUSS, I was in those meetings, I know those people personally, so I'm an ethnographic or embedded like researcher. So that is why it was very easy for me to draw, but I need to really to consider my audience. So that is why I made mention to Homs, because the reference is the sectarian structure. So we have the same paramilitary group in Homs, but a different structure or a different kind of members. So that is the complication, or that is my kind of claim. That is, although they belong to the same umbrella, but they have different. There were different mobilization considerations inside these organizations, and the how and why. Because I'm interested. That is a conscious decision. I'm interested in the process of mobilization, but not in the why. It was just to address the regime kind of strategies or regulation of or kind of countering movements. So that is why it was the interest was in the process, but not in the logic of kind of joining paramilitary groups. And indeed, there are many topics, and so that's why I'm working on a PhD. So I thought that, you know, that it is too little to cover such you know, groups in one paper. So that is why it's like there was a path, or also it is very important to keep the micro focus, because you know, because of the feasibility and access of other researchers. So I am kind of the empirical expert. So it would be very important to bring these micro kind of cases to a wider audience. Yeah, so that is why also the focus is very, you know, geographically it is only the university. So I mean, in terms of feasibility, no other kind of researcher can do that. Only Syrians who have been there can do that. So that is why, yeah.
So
okay.
My point is just explain that in the paper.
Yeah. Maybe it was not explicit. No? Okay. Yeah. But because I had only one complication, which is the communitarian structure, but not the sectarian structure. So that was my point of departure.
I think there are lots of questions, which is great. So let's take 3 questions, and then you have the chance to reply, and then we take another round. And we begin here. So think of that next time. Tomorrow, it's a good idea sitting here at the top, because then you get the chance earlier to pose questions rather than sitting in behind. Please.
I guess you guys probably hear the
Oh.
okay, I guess it's working now. Thanks, Ali, for this presentation. I learned quite a lot from it, although I do work on Syria. But you know, Syria now is, there is so much actually. And I guess we were talking yesterday that each governorate or place in Syria constitutes its own case study, right? So you said that the sectarian dimension doesn't matter here, but in Aleppo, apparently the rural-urban divide was very clear here. So I would just like you to elaborate if the rural-urban divide has been manifested in the recruitment of the Kata'ib Al-Baath. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ali, for your presentation, and I really enjoyed listening to it. And when I was listening, I was thinking that you are talking about post-Soviet countries, because we have almost the same structure, and the local governments are often relying on the semi-criminal and semi-sportsman groups in order to intimidate opposition and their opponents. And you rightly mentioned that these types of groups are not loyal to the state, but loyal to regime. And well, the famous group was like in Ukraine, so-called Titushki, comprised of this wrestlers and MMA fighters who were intimidating pro-Western opposition. But as soon as the overthrow of regime of Yanukovych, these groups vanished. But on the other hand, many new governments and new regimes or like administrations have a temptation to incorporate these guys in their structure and use them. So my question is, after Assad regime lost control over large territories in Syria, so what happened to Shabiha in these particular areas? Did they move to the territories controlled by Assad, or ISIS and other groups incorporated them into their quasi-state structures?
And please be short and precise, because we have a ton of questions I can see.
Okay, Ali, thank you so much for the presentation and also for the topic. Regarding Morton's and Hayyan intervention regarding sectarian belonging, I think a paper that was written by Hamza Al-Mustafa, who is a researcher here, he've done a field work, and at the end he concluded that the sectarianism was not really an issue for the regime, but mainly loyalty to the regime. So I think it might give you some insights in this direction. And two other things. Do you think a comparative analysis with other situations, Lebanon, for instance, during the first period of civil war, might give you additional information? And especially if you would like to conduct some field work, a lot of people are still living, so you can ask them. Something else, do you think, in a continuity to Alexander's question, even though almost nobody has any perspective about the future of the crisis in Syria, in your opinion, what would be the future of those paramilitary groups? In Lebanon, for example, a lot of militias were integrated in the public employment or the public sector, so it was a part to show that actually we gained the war, let's say. Thank you.
And the shorter you can answer, the more questions we can have.
As precise as possible, and yeah, succinct. So indeed, just replying to Hayyan's question about the social, I mean, what I argue also, but it was not. I mean, it's a short paper. It is going to be, you know, in a journal is like the max 8,000. So I didn't have time to elaborate, and there were a lot of topics to cover. And what I argue in the case of Halab, in Aleppo, it was a social struggle. So like social layers struggle, because if you look at the recruits, at the members, they are mainly from the reef, from the urban, from the countryside, not from the because Aleppo is the capital, the economic capital of the country. People you know, have money, they can go leave the country, and also people from the countryside have grievances against those, because there was a great discrimination. And I would like to mention something I mentioned too, but we agree that I won't mention such things to Noor, that Aleppo is very racist, because there is a saying, people say in Aleppo, that Aleppo become clean only during the Eid, during the holidays, because those from the countryside would go back to their villages. So you can see the deep divide in the society. So it's a social struggle rather than a sectarian or identity struggle. Alexander, it's a very good question. Actually, what happens? Just jumping directly to your question. What was happening to the Shabiha? We saw one of the cases when they were caught, they were executed, they were killed for revenge. Those who would make it, they were mainly indeed either joining because IS they have that forgiveness. So if you repent, you are welcome to join. A lot of people rejoined. So, and this is what Califas call ethnic defection. So you have people are defecting from their sect and joining other sects, or kind of like what I call also like sectarian defection. Joining these groups, also switching sides, and in some cases radical changes. From Baathist pan-Arabist ideology to an IS. Ideology. So there were a lot of kind of switching sides, even in the opposition. We have seen that a lot. The longer the conflict, takes, the more complex it becomes, and we have seen a lot of, redefection, or kind of switching sides from time to time. Laura, thank you for the suggestions, but on the comparative analysis, actually I'm not, I didn't read anything on the Lebanese civil war and militia, so that is, but that is very, thanks for the advice, it's worth looking at, but my case was very focused.
Just as for the comparative dimension, sometimes you can also co-author things with other as people who might have an expertise in another area, but you have a shared theoretical interest, and that can also be a useful strategy.
Ali, thank you very much. This is excellent topic, and I think very important topic. I mean, the comparative dimension, other people touched upon it, and we talked last night that maybe you can talk with Ayhan Işık on the paramilitary groups in Turkey in the 1990s and even today, and write a maybe comparative paper, co-author. Also coming from the political science background, I think this is an important topic in the sense of understanding how the authoritarian regimes survive. In the Syrian case, a lot of people attribute to the role of Russia and Iran, but you are telling us an internal dimension. And I mean, after the post-Arab Spring, a lot of people, why Tunisia is success, Syria is a failure, or Libya is a failure. Maybe there's something internal that relates to paramilitary groups. So maybe you can, you said that your advisor is historian, but in terms of the theoretical dimension, I think this is an important topic in terms of understanding how authoritarian regimes survive. Also, another perspective can be coming from security studies. We usually think of, when we usually think about national security, we are mostly talking about state survival, but I think there is a very significant conceptual difference between state survival and regime survival. So, for instance, there is a scholar, Burak Kadercan, a scholar of international relations. He wrote an article in the Journal of International Security about how the Assad regime even abandoned some of its territories in order to survive the regime, like the Kurdish regions, he basically abandoned it to protect the regime. So in that case, territorial integrity does not become an element of state survival. But what is at stake here is the regime survival. I think maybe you can direct your research towards that end as well. I mean, maybe not for your PhD project, but post-PhD. But there's a lot of data, and you know the field, and you can, as Martin said, you can get like 5 or 6 papers out of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, for this very informative paper. It's very important that this micro-level work is done, and lots of generalized statements are often made, as you know, about Syria. And I think it's really important that you're doing all this work. A few questions, comments. First, is there anywhere we can learn more about the 1970s origins of the Shabiha groups, like on the smuggling? That'd be interesting for me to know and to reference in there. And in general, I would ask that you could give us even some more details about all the micro level stuff. You could give us some quotations of their actual rhetoric, or what slogans they would chant at marches while they're harassing people. This will give it might reveal more than you think to look at the actual words that they're using at the time and the language that's used. I've certainly found that myself. You showed us the picture of the Shabiha guys with their muscles and tattoos, and all. That was very interesting. You could go into the more culture and tell us why this is important, this culture of masculinity and things like that would be more interesting to hear about a little bit more. And also, this, you know that you have identified people. That is very important, I think. We could go into more of their like sociological details. You said that the sect doesn't matter, but you didn't tell us why. I mean, not everything has to be, this doesn't have to be the main motivating factor behind the conflict. You don't have to assert that it's the main motivating factor, but like one way you could do it, like in the work of Hanna Batatu, which I find very, he's a historian and political scientist. He uses a lot of charts, and you can learn a lot from these charts guy's name, what neighborhood they're from, what affiliation, their ethnicity, their class background you haven't talked about in here. As you said, Hayen said there's a rural-urban divide, so these kind of, you can get a lot of information about, and you can learn about the constituency that's actually being mobilized in such kind of details. It'd also be good to know, you didn't talk, I understand you have to focus on, your topic is Shabiha and not the activists, the revolutionaries, the opposition to the regime, but you could have it could be important to have a paragraph telling us what the battle lines are at Aleppo University. How many are pro-regime, how many are anti-regime, what's the relative strength at the time, different points in time. I'm sure this changes over time.
And I think we have, in order to enable...
Okay, I understand. The last thing is that it ended very abruptly, and you didn't tell us the story of the battle and siege of Aleppo and how these guys were important, so I was kind of surprised that it stopped there, but I'm sure you're going to, in your longer work, get into that, and also check out the historical literature on counter-revolution.